Due to advances in technology and bioscience, the most efficient ways emerging to treat pain and injury revolve around the nervous system. Using the human body's amazing ability called neuroplasticity, it is now possible to activate increased strength, pain-free movement, and faster healing. This is the Newbie device, a patented electrical stimulation device used for neuromuscular re-education. While conventional treatments for pain and injury only manage symptoms, the Newbie device allows you to work at the source of the problem. Using this approach, 90% of individuals notice meaningful progress in the very first session, and evidence is showing those early results also lead to faster overall recovery from most injuries and surgeries. There's finally help for people having difficulty recovering from injury, living with chronic pain, or experiencing challenging neurological conditions. Ask your doctor or therapist about the Newbie from NewFit, accessing the power of the nervous system to improve outcomes.
Every day at Permobile, we are helping families battling disabilities throughout the world. Our company was founded under one belief that every person has a right to independence and mobility, and that idea is as strong today as it's ever been. Our passion goes into building wheelchairs and complex rehabilitation accessories so that every product is customized for every individual's needs. We are so passionate about giving back to organizations such as Team Luke Hope for Minds that in 2017 we started the Permobile Foundation so that individuals can live a life without limitations. The Permobile Foundation helps them by sponsoring fundraising events, by building accessible playgrounds, and by providing donations such as equipment so that these individuals have access to their independence and mobility. Permobile and the Permobile Foundation are honored to partner with Team Luke Hope for Minds in their efforts to support families and children battling brain injury.
Good morning, everyone. How are you guys this morning? Good. Who knew Dr. Crawford was also a stand-up comedian, right? I mean, that was awesome. I'm not that funny. Whoops. Well, there you go. There's one. But hopefully we'll get some good information for you guys. So my name's Nikki. I'm a clinical nutritionist here in Austin. I specialize in brain balance, so nutrition for the brain specifically. Hi, come on in. And, you know, good nutrition is so important fundamentally, whether you've had a brain injury or not, whether you're a caretaker. I sort of view nutrition as our foundation, right? That if we don't have good nutrients coming in, all the rest of the pieces of the puzzle are more difficult to solve. So we focus a lot on that nutrition, and especially looking at the specifics for each person, because everyone, we are all biochemically unique, right? We have different genetics at play. We have different exposures from our environment that we're interacting in, and that changes the body, and it changes how we assimilate our foods. So I'll change the slide here. There are a few goals we have for today. I want to talk about what neurotransmitter testing is. How many of you have heard of neurotransmitter testing? Two? Awesome. That's going to be exciting for y'all. And we're going to talk about what it is and how does it help in the healing process from a brain injury. That's also can be very effective for our caretakers. So I can't wait to hear the lecture this afternoon on that. And of course, we're going to talk about what are some specific nutrients, some foods, vitamins, things that we can take to help support that repair and healing process. And I welcome questions, interaction if you have anything as we go. So I came across this graphic about the statistics of brain injury, and it just struck me as so true, right? Brain injury is like working on a 1,000-piece puzzle, but some of the pieces are missing and you don't know which ones, right? Doesn't that ring true? There's so many factors that can vary from patient to patient, depending on, the type of injury that we had, And also, how was the person's health before the injury occurred? Which I would argue there are probably some missing links already, just because of the SAD diet. Have y'all heard of the SAD diet? Standard American diet. So some of the effects of brain injury. We're gonna talk about the global effects that are pretty consistent across the board, whether you've had or know someone that's had an anoxic brain injury, or whether it was some type of a traumatic brain injury. At the core of a lot of those injuries is this inflammation that happens at the point of contact or injury, but also the ongoing effects after that injury happened, right? Because we know now, I love what Dr. Crawford said about the slide with, the use of some of the clinical scans and things that we currently have as standard of care are pretty ineffective, right? Because it's nice to identify, say, a CAT scan or MRI. It's nice to see if we've got something right now going on that's big enough to catch. But what about all of the little tiny microscopic, in the capillaries and the different neurotransmitters and ions that are flooding out that we're not able to catch from some of our current imaging things? So those little ions and chemicals are neurotransmitters. So what happens during an injury is there is kind of a big flood of certain neurotransmitters that are released, and this causes ongoing inflammation. So specifically, we're going to talk about some of these, like glutamate, acetylcholine, which is a really fast-acting neurotransmitter, and GABA. And then we see sort of a cascade of inflammation that happens, not just in the brain, but it can spread to the rest of the body and affect other systems. And then, of course, we start to experience those symptoms. So the effects of brain injury can also affect our eating patterns, right? So the injury itself is difficult, but how does it then affect how we're able to take in our nutrition? So whether there is, some injury that causes some dysphagia and we're not able to swallow our foods in the same way, perhaps there's some motor damage that has happened, and so we're not able to feed ourselves as well. These are big impacts that are ongoing. And then, of course, the metabolic changes in the brain create a higher concentration of what we call free radicals or reactive oxygen species. And these are just chemicals that sort of tell the tissues, hey, we're in trouble. We've got a fire going on here. So it calls in some of the other players of the immune system to try to put out that fire. But in the process, triggers some more damage. So lots of things are going on. We also know that in those situations of excess inflammation, the brain becomes even more resistant to insulin and your sugars. So what that means is the energy sources that the brain uses to be fueled become compromised in of itself. So then that can, of course, lead to changes in your intestinal tract as well, whether we're talking about direct blood sugar shifts that happen globally, or even just peristalsis can be affected, where now we're not able to move the foods. Like when you take in a meal, you chew it up, you swallow it, and then you have, thankfully, involuntary muscles that squeeze the food down through your digestive tract. And that's called peristalsis. So sometimes that can be affected as well. So we have to think about all of these players of the injury and how that's affecting our ability to absorb our nutrients. And then, of course, one thing that we're going to talk about more when we get into the foods is this decrease in BDNF. So BDNF, which is brain-derived neurotropic factor. This is one of the really important molecules that helps create energy. There are lots of studies that are showing that it's more when you have lower levels of BDNF in the brain, these are associated with different neurodegenerative disorders. So I couldn't find a lot of data about specifically related to brain injury, but I think it's pretty safe to assume that, you know, we've got lower levels at that point. So BDNF, of course, is important for thinking, learning, brain function. So we're going to talk about some ways to increase that. And of course, the effects on the brain, specifically to neurotransmitters, there's three that I want to sort of focus on, which are these glutamate, dopamine, and histamine. So this was a kind of a neat graphic that shows some of those specific neurotransmitters and how it's affected. You probably can't see this very well from up there, but these are neurotransmitter changes after traumatic brain injury. So we've got from an acute injury, kind of what's happening, and all the way down to the chronic. And the chronic ongoing issues is kind of where I do my most work with people. And specifically with these neurotransmitters, and we're going to define those in the upcoming slide, but we see quite a shift of, you know, we've got, for example, glutamate. Right when an injury happens, we have this burst of glutamate that occurs, and over time, the receptors start to burn out, we run out of that particular neurotransmitter, and we see these big changes. So what are neurotransmitters? Well, I put a definition up here for the left brain folks, but basically think of them as like little emails that the brain sends out through the rest of the body, and they control everything. They're the messengers that control your immune system, your hormones, everything from your heart rate, blood pressure, all of that is regulated, and those signals are literally coming from these neurotransmitters that are released. And this next picture gives you kind of a better graphic. I'm a very visual person. I like to draw too. I don't draw on my windows, but that's a good idea. So we have these little vesicles. So this, let me just kind of explain what this is. This is a picture of a synapse, basically. So the synapse is the location between two nerve cells, and you've got one nerve cell here. It's called the axon terminal, up next to this other nerve cell, and those cells don't actually touch each other, okay? This is true throughout the entire nervous system. They don't touch. There's this little junction called the synapse, and that's where these little chemical messengers do all of their work. So what happens is, if you think of the brain, and it's kind of like a circuit board, right? An electrical circuits. So we have a signal that says, I want to raise my arm up. So my brain sends these signals through these little vesicles that come down. They're released into this synapse, and these little vesicles are the neurotransmitters themselves. Sorry if you guys can't see that very well. They are then taken up by this receptor on the postsynaptic neuron, right? So they're kind of like little catcher's gloves on that corresponding neuron. So those are bound and then are absorbed, and then the signal propagates on down the synapse. Does that make sense? So, emails. And there's actually over 100 different neurotransmitters that we have identified in the research so far. There's only a handful that have really been studied in an asymptomatic population for the neurotransmitter testing that I'm going to talk about shortly. And these neurotransmitters are actually created, we make them from our dietary proteins, right? So that's why it's so imperative that we're getting plenty of good proteins in our diet. We classify these neurotransmitters into two groups based on how they behave in the body. So they're either going to be what we call an inhibitory neurotransmitter, which just means calming, or it's going to be an excitatory neurotransmitter, which is stimulating. So I always tell patients to think of it like the brakes, like a car. You know, you've got the brakes on the car versus the accelerator. So your inhibitory neurotransmitters, things like serotonin, GABA, those are going to be the braking system. Whereas your excitatory neurotransmitters are the accelerator, glutamate, histamine. And balance, of course, is absolutely essential. So just a little bit about those. Serotonin, which is one of the primary inhibitory neurotransmitters, we sort of think of it as the master neurotransmitter. It plays a significant role in pain modulation, in mood balance. It's sort of thought of as your sleep neurotransmitter, metabolism, all of these things. And serotonin also is an agonist for progesterone. So a lot of times, my women who are having trouble sleeping at night, when we get older in age, a lot of times it's related to the down regulation of serotonin, where it starts to affect estrogen, and estrogen vice versa goes down, and there can be a relationship there. So it's also important for the GI tract. About 90% of your serotonin is actually produced in the gut. So when we think about, inflammation, almost always, if there is inflammation in the brain, there's inflammation in the gut as well. Because the same epithelial tissues that make up the lining of your small intestine also makes up the blood-brain barrier. So have you guys heard of this concept of leaky gut syndrome? Yeah. So pretty hot topic in functional medicine right now, but it's pretty safe to say that if we've got a leaky gut, we probably also have a leaky brain as well. So that's one thing that I focus a lot on in my practice, is sort of shoring up those gaps so that we strengthen that integrity. The other big inhibitory neurotransmitter we think about is GABA. So GABA is it's the predominant neurotransmitter in the nervous system. Very also important for sleep. Serotonin plays more of a role in helping us fall asleep, whereas GABA really comes in and helps us to stay asleep. So it's also, GABA is an important balancer for glutamate, right? And glutamate being one of those neurotransmitters we pay a lot of attention to after inflammation and injury. So some of the excitatory neurotransmitters that we look at, the accelerator on the car, dopamine, which is our main focus neurotransmitter. This is our pleasure neurotransmitter, gives us our joy. It is, call it a buddy of serotonin, because there is kind of a symbiotic relationship between the two. Oftentimes when serotonin and GABA are struggling, dopamine we'll see start to overexcrete to try to compensate for that. And I'll explain what that means in just a minute. But norepinephrine and epinephrine, of course, these are kind of your fight or flight neurotransmitters. They're produced in the adrenal glands. Do you guys know much about the adrenals? Does that sound familiar? Yes, no, maybe so. So the adrenals are so important when we're thinking about injury and stress for everyone, because they are two little glands that sit piggyback on top of your kidneys, and they're responsible for helping your body cope with stress. So whether that is an actual physical stressor from a trauma or injury, or my child is hurting, an emotional stressor, it's ongoing, and the brain doesn't know the difference, right? So when we have these messages coming in of stress, it triggers these neurotransmitters to be released, along with a hormone called cortisol, which is a stress hormone from the adrenals. And that's not good over time. We have these mechanisms in place, like Dr. Crawford was saying, where either, you shut down and play possum, or you get up and fight, or get up and run, right? That's all to do with the release of norepinephrine and epinephrine, specifically from the neurotransmitter perspective. And over time, if we can't do something to turn that signal off, we get a pretty significant imbalance. And that's where the testing can come in. Histamine also, huge player. We think about histamine, especially here in Austin, with all of the pollens and good old cedar season just around the corner, right? So histamine is also a neuromodulator, so it can behave as a neurotransmitter too. And when we're looking at these values, mostly what we're catching in urine is a gut-mediated histamine, but it's a pretty good indication of what can be going in the central nervous system as well. But it plays a role in of course, your immune response, your sleep-wake cycle, and affects the GI tract. And we're going to talk more about that in just a little bit. So then glutamate, of course, we all heard a lot about glutamate. It is the primary excitatory neurotransmitter in the brain and nervous system. And when we have an injury, glutamate is one of the primary players that is spilled out at high levels and sometimes ongoing, so at the actual focal point. And we need it. It's a good thing, but there normally are mechanisms that bring it back into the cell. But unfortunately, when there is the trauma that occurs, it sort of, one nerve cell or brain cell can spill out its glutamate levels, and then the other guys next to it go, oh my gosh, well, he's dumping everything out. We're going to dump all ours out too. And then it just kind of creates this domino effect. And then that biochemically is what leads to these increases in, the inflammatory cytokines and all of those other markers. So definitely something that we want to look at. So aside from the brain injuries, I just wanted to talk a little bit about what are some of the other causes of imbalances for these neurotransmitters. And of course, our diet plays a big role in that, right? Because we make our neurotransmitters from the proteins that we consume. And so many people either don't eat enough proteins, or perhaps, we're, moving more to a plant-based diet, which I love, and we can delve into that debate. But we also, as a brain nutritionist, I want to make sure that you're still getting adequate amounts of protein so that you can make your brain chemicals, because you're not going to feel very good after a while. And I have to say, a lot of my vegan vegetarian patients over time start to experience sleep issues or start to feel a little depressed, and we can sort of trace it back to we're not getting the right balance of proteins when we switch to that kind of diet. So I threw in the formula here so that you guys would have, and you'll have access to these slides, so don't feel like you have to take vigorous notes, if you can even see that very well. But to calculate your daily protein intake, you take your body weight in pounds multiplied by 0.36, and that gives you kind of a gram value of how much you should be shooting for. And just to kind of give you a perspective, a chicken breast that's the size of the palm of your hand would give you somewhere between 6 to 10 grams of protein. So kind of thinking about what you're getting. The other challenge that people run into is we're not rotating our proteins very well, right? So we tend to sort of eat the same things every day, and that's not good because, number one, we want to get a different profile of amino acids, and amino acids being the building blocks of proteins, because those amino acids are literally what the body converts into neurotransmitters, right? It's kind of like with Thanksgiving coming up, everybody knows you have a bunch of turkey, then what happens? You fall asleep, right? And that's because turkey is full of tryptophan, and tryptophan is one of the precursors to serotonin. You get a nice little boost of serotonin after you have some turkey. You feel great, but you're sleepy. And then you wake up and you want more, right? So that's why we want to rotate things. And then, of course, consuming too many processed foods, back to the SAD diet, the standard American diet, where I think people are starting to come a lot more aware of some of the junk in the foods. But eating too many of those foods that are laden with chemicals and the wrong balance of things can affect your brain chemistry. And then, of course, this is actually a pretty big one, undiagnosed food sensitivities. So that we could do a whole topic on food sensitivities and food allergies. And it's my opinion that a lot of the patients that I see specifically with brain injuries, I think have already been dealing with an underlying food sensitivity before the injury even occurred. And so it was like, the smoldering ashes, and then we had the injury and somebody threw diesel on the fire and boom, now we've got this terrible flame burn that's going on that's kind of out of control. So we have to, from a nutritional standpoint, we have to back up and we have to think about what's going on in the gut, what foods are we being exposed to that's telling the brain that stress response, right? Because we can't take away the trauma that happened, but we can turn the volume down on these other signals that are occurring from things like an unknown food sensitivity. So aside from just consumption of poor foods, what about all the folks, I had a lady this last week who has been dealing with sort of a chronic autoimmune condition, and she eats wonderfully. I mean, she could be my poster child for, getting in her 8 to 10 servings of vegetables, fruits. She's juicing, she's, everything's non-GMO, it's organic. I mean, she's doing everything right, but she can't get this autoimmune thing under control. And we started talking about it. She brought in her blood work, which is one thing that we do. There is a marker in just standard blood work called alkaline phosphatase that is a good indicator for if someone has adequate stomach acid, right? So if you're not able to digest your foods well, you might be eating all this great stuff, but you're not breaking it down and your body's not absorbing those good nutrients. So in the case of HCl, hydrochloric acid is one of the primary digestive enzymes in your tummy. And naturally, as we age, about 30 and on, we stop producing as much HCl as we need to adequately break down our proteins. But it's also important for sterilizing our foods, right? So if we don't sterilize our foods, that's when we can run into bacteria, viruses, things that we might be consuming that can have detrimental effects. So that's a huge piece of the puzzle that so many practitioners overlook, in my opinion, is making sure that you're digesting your foods properly. So of course, beneficial bacteria, looking at the balance of the good guys and the bad guys in the gut is kind of all the rage right now too. We call that the microbiome in the GI tract. And having, exposure to antibiotics, maybe as a child, or maybe, we're just coming out of an inpatient situation where we've been given IV antibiotics, which are necessary, but we have to think about what effect does that have on the microbiome in our body, because it kills the bad guys, but it kills all the good guys too. And so many of our pieces of our immune system, our neurotransmitters are produced from the beneficial bacteria in our gut. They play a role in that, right? So if we don't do something to help repopulate the good flora, then we're setting the stage for another stress signal to the brain. So does kind of making sense here, all these different areas where, aside from the injury itself, we can be affecting. So, and then of course, looking at just basic highway structure, right? If the neurotransmitters are the cars on the highway, what's the highway look like? Do we have a bunch of potholes? Do we have bridges that have collapsed? What is going on in those nerve membranes? So all of these nerve cells are encoded by the myelin sheath, right? And that myelin sheath is made up of good fats, basically. And this is why you hear so much about, like you're eating so much good healthy fish, cold water fish and avocados and medium chain triglycerides and phosphatidylserine and all of these healthy fats that make up that myelin sheath. They make up the highway. So if we're not getting enough in the diet, which a lot of people don't, they're getting the wrong kinds, right? They're getting a lot of saturated fats from processed foods, or we're back to also not absorbing it. Maybe we've got some gallbladder issues. Maybe we've had our gallbladder removed and now we can't emulsify our fats properly. So once it gets down into the small intestine, we're not absorbing them well. So that affects the brain chemistry as well. So I just wanted to kind of throw some symptoms up here. I mean, this could be 5 times as big, symptoms of an unbalanced brain. And these can be for both after a brain injury and before, and also for our caretakers, because the situation of having imbalanced neurotransmitters affects all of these areas. So some big ones that I run into after an injury, of course, are the headaches, depression, anxiety, and of course it depends on the type of injury. And just so I kind of understand, how many people are here for a loved one who's had a traumatic brain injury? Let me see a show of hands. Okay. And how many for an anoxic brain injury? Okay, got it. So the way that we address that nutritionally is going to be a little bit different, but from the inflammation standpoint, it's the same. So the symptoms are going to present a little differently for both of those areas. So let's talk exactly about what is neurotransmitter testing. So this is a very easy test to do, and I have to say, before 2007, I was working in a doctor's office doing just your standard, cardiovascular support diets and things like that, and I could write the most brilliantly planned diet for someone, meal plan, and they could do it for maybe a few days, a few weeks, maybe a couple months, but eventually we would kind of fall back into our old habits, right? And that's when I just started looking at what's going on in the brain, what signals, why are we falling back to these patterns? And that's what brought me to neurotransmitter testing. So it is a practice that's actually in Europe. It's kind of a standard of care there, and was developed in Germany back in the 60s. And it's not a diagnostic tool, and I always like to be very clear about that, but it does give us a lot of good information, right? There needs to be more clinical trials, and in order for something to be within that scope of diagnoses, you get into a political argument, but it gives us a snapshot as to what's going on in the brain and the nervous system. So it's super easy to do. It's actually a urine collection that you do from the comfort of home. And we have the patient collect their second morning urine because we want to see what the brain's doing after we've been up and making decisions and going through our day, as opposed to while we were sleeping. And the technology is actually a dry spot ELISA method is how it's evaluated. So there's several labs out there within the realm of functional medicine that offer this testing. But it's super helpful. We say test, don't guess, right? Right now, unfortunately, in the mental health field anyways, it's a very subjective model, right? We're just sort of going off of what the patient reports clinically. We don't have a good way to measure other than doing a spinal tap, which we're not going to do that. But this gives us sort of a snapshot or a footprint as to what's going on in the nervous system.
So that's just their urine?
Yes, ma'am. Yep. It's a urine collection. And we have, I work with a lot of kiddos as well for like the focus issues and school, report cards are about to come out, all that stuff. So we have some little collection devices that you can just stick over their genitals to catch the urine, which is also really helpful for some of my brain injured patients if we're not able to do it the normal way. So,
is this really available through the commercial apps such as Quest and LabCorp and so on?
No, unfortunately.
What's the specific profile and where is it?
There are some specific companies. The one that I like to use is through the Makamel Institute. The name was changed from Neurogistics. Labrix, Doctors Data, offers it. There's a company called Neuroscience that offers a panel. So there's several companies out there.
Approximate cost?
Depends on which panel you do.
Obviously, now you have to move the panel.
Yeah, well, right, but that's where I come in. The panel that I use, which we're going to look at a report here in just a minute, but it's about $250 cash price. And if you get a doctor to write a prescription for it, which some will, some won't, then you can get some insurance reimbursement for it. But so there are a few of the neurotransmitters I wanted to really highlight because of their effects on brain injury, one of them being glutamate. So glutamate, so important because research overwhelmingly suggests that excess release of glutamate is one of the earliest and most crucial steps in the destructive cascade of events in the traumatized brain. And glutamate's relationship to neurological damage is that of cause and effect. So, of course, the immediate onset, you see these high levels of glutamate, but then you can still see elevations months, even years afterwards, because we're not effectively reining those values back in. Physicians establish that the chances for recovery from stroke or head trauma are better the lower the levels of glutamate are within the spaces between brain cells. So this is important, right? And if there's anything that we can do from a nutrition standpoint to reduce that, let's do it. And there is. So the other one, dopamine, also is a big neurotransmitter and modulator. It can have some effects when glutamate is elevated. It can start to overexcrete as well, which triggers more inflammation in the brain. And ongoing especially, you see some of these specific symptoms that are occurring months and years after, with difficulty in learning, memory, short-term memory, so those of you who can't see this, attention and processing speed, memory, executive function, and emotional lability. Maybe mood changes, maybe we're a little more moody than we used to be. That has a lot to do with dopamine. So histamine as well, we touched on this just a little bit. But histamine is unique. We find that very often we see these high levels of histamine when there's a food at play that we're sensitive to. For example, dairy, cow's dairy specifically, is a very excitotoxic food, right? Casein, the casein, which is the protein from milk that's in the dairy cows that we use predominantly in this country, is very difficult for the body to break down, right? We don't have the proper enzymes to do that. So the body starts to produce these low levels of immune responses every time we drink milk. So, but what happens, you go to your doctor and you're saying, hey, I'm worried about my child, their calcium. We'll give them some more milk, increase your milk. No. That's outdated information. There are better ways of getting calcium in, but first we've got to take those insulting foods out to slow down that process. So histamine is one of the markers that I look for in an initial evaluation to see, okay, do we have something going on with foods here? And it doesn't tell us specifically that, but it's a pretty good marker. We'll see histamine values higher when people are sensitive to this kind of the top 5, which is cow's dairy, gluten, corn, soy, and egg whites tend to be the most insulting for histamine and brain inflammation.
Question about the milk.
Yes, sir.
You mentioned the casein, that there's an A1 and A2. You can buy
Correct.
milk now that's A2.
Yes.
Regular, low fat, and chocolate.
Yes.
I'm not saying anything with half and half, and I don't know, does half and half still have enough milk protein in it?
Yes. To be detrimental, yes.
Yeah, so I've not seen an A2 half and half.
I haven't either. I wish they would come out with one. But what he's asking about, have you guys seen the A2 milk in the stores? That one is okay. So casein A1 is specifically the protein that's so inflammatory to the gut and the brain. So the A2 milk is better because they take that, it's actually from a different breed of cow altogether. So Yeah, I wish that we'll have to have some of that and developed. Yes, ma'am.
Is that like clearly marked, or is it something you need to look like deep into the back?
Good question. It's not clearly marked. The A2 brand, that's easy to find. It says A2 milk.
Okay.
Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
First,
I feel
okay.
Like this just look like regular milk. And you have
Oh,
to put the
gotcha.
ingredients.
Yeah. No, it's a brand that's called A2. I've seen it. I feel like I saw it at Costco even. Yeah, H-E-B, Sprouts. Yep, they all have it. So.
Put it at the high level where you can't reach it easily.
Yeah. Right. Exactly. Yes, ma'am.
So the A2 milk, so that particular casing is easier for us to be able to digest.
Exactly. It doesn't have the same effects as the A1 milk and what happens is because of the leaky gut situation that's probably been going on for a while, the immune system, when it sees that casein molecule, starts to get involved. And it's the same with gluten. There is a specific digestive enzyme that we're going to talk about that can help us break down specifically casein A1 and gluten. But yeah, it's just a difficult protein.
It's about $1.50 more than the regular size.
Of course, until we start buying it, right? There's power in numbers. So this is just a picture of what the test kit looks like. It's just a little box that you get. I have them in my office. I hand them out. I don't charge anything for them. You pay the lab directly when you send it in. But to his question, it costs about $250 to do the test. And what it will do, well, actually, before I show you the report, this is, it's pretty cool. The German technology is pretty amazing. I don't know if you can see this, but this is kind of like a little matchbook looking thing. So you collect your midstream sample, you pour, this little tube has a little blue powder in there that you can't see, but you mix up, and then this has a test strip that you just dunk in there and it saturates, and then you set it up on your counter like this to dry for 24 hours. And once it's dry, it's stable for up to 6 months. So we used to have to ship urine across the pond with ice packs, and it was just a real fun time. But now we have a newer, more innovative way of doing it that's so much easier. So that's what the test kit looks like. Now let me show you what a report looks like. And again, I'm sorry, so tiny for you guys back in the room. But and like I said, there's several labs that do this. I prefer this particular lab because I've used them for so long. But it gives you kind of a breakdown of all of these neurotransmitters. So serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, epinephrine, a ratio of those, GABA, glutamate, glycine, histamine. And we measure all of these against creatinine to make sure the kidneys are functioning well and we got a good value. But it's super important. I'm going to watch my time here. We're running low. This is actually a slide or a result from a brain injured patient. So we have the initial baseline test here. And just to give you an example, we had at the baseline, his dopamine was 346, which it should be between 125 and 175. When we retested him, it was down to 285. So with some nutritional interventions, we're able to help bring those values back into a more healthy range. Same thing with glutamate. We started out at 27. It shouldn't be any higher than 16. And a few months later, I should say, we're down to 24. Histamine started out at 146. The range is 20 to 45. On the retest, we're down to 57. And that's one of the big first steps, is getting histamine down under control.
The time interval between
Those, yeah.
Look to see if you're making an effective maneuver.
Minimum is 4 to 6 weeks, I would say. I like to retest about 8 weeks. It takes that long for the body to assimilate some of the nutrients that we use. So from this test, when we figure out that, okay, we've got histamine being super elevated, we will customize a protocol both with foods and nutrients to help target those specific values that were out of range for the person. And that's why it's really targeted and customized, right? Because it's different for everyone. And one of the best things we can do to reduce histamine is vitamin C. That's why we've got to get lots of vegetables and, fruits, phytonutrients, things like that. And I want to make sure we have time. We go till 11:15, guys? Is that? Okay. I want to talk a little bit about these plans here. So the Mito Food Plan, this stands for mitochondrial support. This is something that I'm very passionate about for helping to reduce inflammation. This is from the Institute of Functional Medicine. Have some really great tools that I use in the practice. So we have these therapeutic foods that give us an adequate supply of our proteins, fats, our B vitamins, CoQ10, antioxidants. We need the protective antioxidants. And let me go back, sorry, went too fast there. Anti-inflammatory nutrients are important. Intermittent fasting. There's lots of stuff about ketogenic options, and ketogenic diets can be really helpful in brain injury recovery. However, it can also do a number on the microbiome, and there's some pieces of it that really, it just kind of depends on the person. We have to make sure we match it and making sure that we're getting enough of the vegetables and things in, which a lot of people leave out. So the recovery diet that I recommend, eat low carb. Limit your carbohydrates because that converts quickly to glucose and that contributes to more inflammation in the brain. We want to focus more on good fats from cold water fish, your avocados, ghee, these types of things. And, oh, sorry, was there a question? No. We want to avoid the fast foods and processed foods because they're also laden with food preservatives with glutamate. So MSG, DSG, these stands for disodium glutamate, monosodium glutamate. Guess what? It's the same glutamate, basically, that causes more inflammation in the brain. So this is why we want to avoid a lot of those. And the food industry has gotten very sneaky, and they don't have to label it as MSG. They can label it as natural flavoring. So watch for that on your food labels as well. It's shocking. Focus on your clean proteins, wild-caught, organic, non-GMO sources. Vegetables. Vegetables are so important in fruits and vegetables. Here's kind of a little picture of things that we can do foods to focus on for a healthy brain, right? Because that's full of phytonutrients that are going to mop up the free radicals that are floating around from the trauma. And for those of you who are looking for tube feeding options, this is a company that I really like. It's called Kate Farms. I don't work for them. I have no affiliations with them, but I just wanted you to have some options because so many of the liquid foods that are available for tube feeding have so much junk in them. They've got soy and milk and glutamate. I mean, it's really, really awful. This company, I really respect them a lot, and they have options for all of those. katefarms.com. Well, if it's tube feeding, we're not going to have to worry about it as much, but the taste is pretty, I think that it's good. But your taste buds change every 20 to 30 days, right? So if we take a little bitty bite of something every day, over time, we can start to like it better. That's the one bite rule with kids, right? You have them take one little bite. So.
For adults that have
yeah.
problems with food.
Yes. There's different flavors, and it just depends. I think it tastes good. It tastes like better than an Ensure or something like that, in my opinion. So these are some of the nutrients that I think are really key. Of course, there are more, but the really core of it from the neurotransmitter test is such an important tool that can give us some specific guidance to what each person needs. So the amino acid support, that's what helps to rebuild the neurotransmitters that are out of balance. So, in summary, we talked about neurotransmitter testing and easy in-home collection that helps us identify some of these key players so that we can create that personal plan to fit the person's needs. And some references here. I'll give you guys a copy. And for anybody that wants to learn more, if you just text HOPE to this phone number, it's my personal cell phone number, and I will reach out and we can schedule like a 10-minute, 20-minute, whatever discovery call. So we could just talk about maybe some questions that you have and specific circumstances that maybe you're facing. I also have a protocol sheet out on the table if anyone would like that, that talks about the MITO plan and some basic things I think are important that you can walk home or walk away with and implement today. All right. Any questions? You're welcome. Thank you. Thank you.